One night I was on patrol duty in a small town in Ohio. It was one of those nights where everything felt just a little off. The streets were unusually quiet, and an eerie fog had settled over the area. The dense mist seemed to swallow up all sound, making even the hum of my cruiser feel distant and muffled. It was nearing midnight when my radio crackled to life with a call that made my skin crawl. Unit 4, disturbance reported at the old Miller warehouse. Possible break-in. Proceed with caution. The Miller warehouse had been abandoned for years, a decaying relic of the town's industrial past. It was a place kids dared each other to visit, and rumors of hauntings had circulated for as long as I could remember. Despite my unease, I responded to the call and headed toward the outskirts of town. When I arrived, the warehouse loomed ahead, shrouded in fog. Its broken windows and crumbling facade gave it a sinister, almost malevolent appearance. I parked my cruiser and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. I radioed in my location and approached the entrance, my flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness. Inside, the air was cold and damp, filled with the stench of mold and decay. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional drip of water echoing in the distance. I swept my flashlight across the room, revealing piles of old machinery and debris. As I moved further in, I started hearing faint whispers, like the echoes of a distant conversation. My radio crackled again, but this time it was only static. I tried to call for backup, but the signal was dead. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence, echoing through the cavernous space. I sprinted toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst into a large room at the back of the warehouse. The floor was covered in broken glass and rusted metal, and the walls were lined with graffiti and strange symbols. In the center of the room stood a young woman, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. She was surrounded by a group of shadowy figures, their forms barely visible in the dim light. "Help me!" she screamed, reaching out toward me. I drew my gun and shone my flashlight on the figures, but they vanished as quickly as they had appeared. The woman collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. I rushed to her side, trying to calm her down and get some answers. "Who were they? What happened here?" I asked, but she was too hysterical to respond. I radioed for an ambulance and backup, my hands trembling. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The whispers had stopped, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. When the paramedics arrived, they took the woman away, still in a state of shock. My colleagues searched the warehouse but found no sign of the shadowy figures. In the days that followed, I tried to piece together what had happened. The woman, once she had calmed down, could only recall vague, fragmented details, visions of dark rituals and chanting voices. The symbols on the walls were analyzed, but no one could identify their origin. The town buzzed with speculation and fear, but no concrete answers ever emerged. I returned to the warehouse several times, trying to find some clue, some explanation. But each time I was met with the same oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched. The whispers haunted my dreams, and the memory of that night stayed with me, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. I was working the night shift in a small town in rural Texas, a place where nothing much ever happened. The night was calm, with a full moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. It was the kind of night that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. Around 2 a.m., I received a call from dispatch about a broken-down vehicle on Route 22, a deserted highway notorious for strange occurrences. I drove out to the location, the road stretching ahead of me like a ribbon of darkness. The radio played softly in the background, a welcome distraction from the oppressive silence. As I neared the area, I saw the car, a beat-up old sedan, parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking weakly. I pulled over and approached the vehicle, flashlight in hand. The driver, a middle-aged man with a haunted look in his eyes, was sitting inside, staring straight ahead. I tapped on the window, and he jumped, as if he'd been in a trance. "Everything okay here?" I asked as he rolled down the window. The man nodded but didn't say anything. His hands were shaking, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Can you tell me what happened?" I pressed. He finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. The car just stopped, and then I saw something. Saw what? I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. Something out there. He gestured toward the empty fields that lined the highway. I scanned the area with my flashlight but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Do you need a tow? The man shook his head. I don't need a tow. I need to get out of here. Please just help me. I called for a tow truck anyway, just to be safe, and stayed with the man until it arrived. As we waited, I tried to get more details out of him, but he was too shaken to say much. He kept glancing nervously into the darkness, as if expecting something to emerge. When the tow truck finally came, the driver hooked up the sedan, and we all started to head back to town. As I followed the truck, my radio crackled to life with static, and then a woman's voice came through, distorted and faint. Help me, it said, sending a shiver down my spine. I glanced at my radio, wondering if I'd imagined it, but then it came again, clearer this time. Help me, please. I tried to respond, but the radio went dead. I checked in with dispatch, but they hadn't received any distress calls. Unease settled over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As we drove down Route 22, the moonlight casting long shadows across the road, I saw something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the highway. I slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop, my heart racing. The tow truck driver saw it too and stopped just in time. The figure was a woman dressed in a long, flowing white gown, her hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. She looked like she had stepped out of a nightmare. Her eyes were hollow and her skin was as pale as the moonlight that illuminated her. I got out of the cruiser, my hand on my holstered gun. Ma'am, are you all right? She didn't respond. Instead, she turned and started walking away, heading toward the fields. I followed her, calling out, but she seemed to drift further into the darkness with each step. Suddenly, she vanished, leaving me alone in the middle of the road. I stood there, my breath visible in the cold night air, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The tow truck driver joined me, his face pale with fear. Did you see that? He asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, still in shock. We both heard the man's voice from the car, shouting for us to hurry up. We got back in our vehicles and drove back to town, the haunting figure lingering in our minds. Later, I did some digging and found out that Route 22 had a dark history. Years ago, a young woman had been killed in a hit and run on that very stretch of road. Her body was never found, and her spirit was said to haunt the highway, searching for someone to help her find peace. To this day, I can't drive down Route 22 without thinking about that night. The woman's voice on the radio, her ghostly figure in the road, it's all too real, a chilling reminder that some spirits never rest. I had been a police officer for over a decade in New Orleans, a city with a rich history and a reputation for the supernatural. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened one stormy night in the old precinct on Basin Street. It was late, and the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming against the windows and casting eerie shadows throughout the building. Most of the officers had already gone home, leaving only a skeleton crew to man the phones and handle any late-night emergencies. I was in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee, when the power suddenly went out. I cursed under my breath, grabbed a flashlight, and headed to the basement to check the fuse box. The basement of our precinct was a maze of narrow hallways and storage rooms, and it had always given me the creeps. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and I could feel a sense of unease settling over me. When I reached the basement, I heard a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone was gently knocking on a door. I shone my flashlight around, but the beam only revealed rows of dusty shelves and old filing cabinets. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. I followed the sound to a door at the far end of the hallway. It was an old interrogation room that hadn't been used in years. The door was ajar, and the tapping was coming from inside. I pushed the door open and stepped into the room, my flashlight flickering as if it were struggling to stay on. The room was empty, save for a single chair and a table covered in dust. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. As I turned to leave, my flashlight went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with it, trying to get it to work, when I heard a whisper behind me. "Help me!" I spun around, heart pounding, but saw no one. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Help me, please!" A cold chill ran down my spine, and I could feel my breath quicken. I managed to get the flashlight working again and swept the beam across the room. In the corner, I saw her, a young woman, her eyes wide with terror and her hands bound with rope. She looked at me, her lips trembling as she mouthed the words, "Help me." I rushed toward her, but as I reached out, she vanished. I was left standing in the empty room, my heart racing and my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. I hurried back upstairs and found my partner, Officer Mitchell, at the front desk. He looked up, puzzled by my expression. "What's wrong?" I explained what had happened, and we both went back to the basement to investigate. When we reached the interrogation room, there was no sign of the woman. The room was just as empty and dusty as before. Mitchell checked the records and found nothing unusual about the room. No recent interrogations, no history of violence. We were about to leave when the tapping started again, this time echoing through the entire basement. We followed the sound to a locked storage room. With some effort, we forced the door open and stepped inside. The room was filled with old evidence boxes, and the air was thick with dust and decay. In the center of the room, we found an old weathered trunk. It was padlocked, but the lock was rusted and brittle. We broke it open and lifted the lid. Inside, we found a collection of old police files, some dating back to the 1940s. Among them was a file about a woman named Elizabeth Taylor, who had been arrested for a series of murders. According to the file, she had claimed to be possessed by a spirit that forced her to kill. As we read through the file, the tapping grew louder, and we both felt a presence in the room. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered. We could hear whispers, faint but unmistakable. Elizabeth's voice echoed in our ears, pleading for help. We closed the trunk and backed out of the room, our nerves on edge. The tapping followed us all the way back to the main floor, where it finally stopped. We knew we had encountered something beyond our understanding, something that defied logic and reason. The next day, we had the trunk and its contents moved to a secure location, and the precinct was blessed by a priest. But even with these precautions, the old precinct on Basin Street never felt the same. Officers reported strange noises, cold spots, and sightings of a woman in old-fashioned clothing. To this day, I can still hear Elizabeth's voice in my dreams, a chilling reminder of the night I came face to face with the supernatural. The possessed precinct remains a haunting memory, a testament to the dark history that lingers in the shadows of New Orleans. I had been a detective in a small Midwestern town for nearly 15 years, and though I'd seen my share of gruesome scenes and unsettling cases, nothing ever quite prepared me for the events that transpired on Elm Street. The street had a long history of strange occurrences and disappearances, but most of it had been chalked up to urban legend until that fateful night. It was a chilly autumn evening, and the wind howled through the nearly deserted streets. I was working the night shift when the call came in. Dispatch reported a possible break-in at the old Jenkins house, a place that had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Neighbors had heard screams and saw lights flickering inside the house. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, my partner, Officer Davis, right behind me. The Jenkins house stood at the end of Elm Street, its dilapidated structure cloaked in shadows. The stories about the place were numerous. Ghosts, curses, you name it. But I had always been a skeptic. As we pulled up, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. There was something undeniably sinister about the house. We exited the car and approached the front door, which was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and it creaked ominously, revealing a dark, dusty interior. The smell of mold and decay was overpowering. Flashlights in hand, we stepped inside, the wooden floorboards creaking under our weight. The house was deathly silent except for the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. "Let's split up and cover more ground," I suggested, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was settling in my gut. Davis nodded and headed toward the stairs while I moved deeper into the house. The air grew colder as I walked through the dimly lit rooms, my flashlight casting long shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. I heard a faint whisper, like someone calling my name, but when I turned around, there was no one there. I found myself in what appeared to be the living room. Old, tattered furniture was scattered about, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. As I scanned the room, I noticed something peculiar. A large ornate mirror hanging above the fireplace. It looked out of place, almost too pristine for such a neglected house. As I approached it, the whispering grew louder, and I could see a faint glow emanating from the mirror's surface. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and I could see my breath forming clouds in front of me. I reached out to touch the mirror, and the moment my fingers brushed its surface, I was engulfed in a blinding light. When my vision cleared, I was no longer in the living room. I was in a dark, narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were lined with portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. "Detective!" Davis's voice echoed from somewhere ahead, filled with panic. I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing unnaturally. The hallway twisted and turned, defying all logic. I finally burst into a large room at the end, where I found Davis standing in the center, staring at something in horror. "What is it?" I asked, panting. He pointed a trembling finger at a corner of the room. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a malevolent grin. His presence exuded pure evil, and I could feel the air around him crackling with dark energy. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure stepped forward, and the room seemed to darken with each step. "I am the guardian of this house," he hissed, his voice like nails on a chalkboard, "and you are trespassing." Before we could react, the figure lunged at us with inhuman speed. Davis and I were thrown across the room, slamming into the walls. Pain shot through my body, but I forced myself to stand. I could see Davis struggling to get up, his face twisted in fear. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, helping him to his feet. We bolted for the door, the figure's laughter echoing behind us. The house seemed to come alive, doors slamming shut and furniture shifting to block our path. We stumbled through the maze of rooms, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices telling us to leave, to never return. Finally, we burst through the front door and into the night, the cold air hitting us like a splash of water. We didn't stop running until we reached the patrol car. Gasping for breath, we looked back at the house, which now stood silent and dark, as if nothing had happened. We radioed for backup, and soon the house was swarming with officers. But no matter how thoroughly they searched, they found no sign of the figure or the strange hallway. The mirror in the living room was shattered, its pieces scattered across the floor. The old Jenkins house was sealed off, and the town council eventually decided to have it demolished. To this day, I can still hear the whispers and see the figure's hollow eyes in my nightmares. Elm Street remains a place of dark memories, and I avoid it whenever I can. Some things are best left buried in the past, where they can't reach out and drag you into the darkness.